What do you picture when you think of a medieval queen? Do you imagine a quiet woman sitting in a castle, waiting for her king to return from war? Eleanor of Aquitaine was nothing like that image. She was born in the warm, sunny lands of southern France, where poets sang songs of love beneath castle windows. She grew up surrounded by music, art and learning. This woman would become queen of 2 different kingdoms. She would ride on crusade to the Holy Land. She would raise kings and shape the future of Europe. Her story stretches across 8 decades of adventure, scandal, war and survival. Welcome to the entire story of Eleanor of Aquitaine. The story of Eleanor's family begins long before her birth. The House of Poitiers had risen to prominence over centuries of warfare, marriage and political manoeuvring. By the time Eleanor was born, her family had been ruling Aquitaine for generations. They had accumulated wealth, power and prestige. They had also developed a distinctive family character. The rulers of Aquitaine were known for their independence, their love of culture, and their willingness to defy convention. Eleanor's grandfather was one of the most remarkable figures in medieval history. William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, was a larger-than-life character who combined military prowess with artistic creativity. He was a warrior who led armies into battle. He was also a poet, the first troubadour whose works have survived to our time. In him, the martial and cultural traditions of Aquitaine found perfect expression. William IX was born around the year 1071. He inherited the duchy of Aquitaine while still young. From the beginning, he showed a restless, adventurous spirit. He was not content to sit in his castle and administer his lands. He sought glory and excitement. He joined the First Crusade, that great military expedition that sought to capture the Holy Land from Muslim control. He arrived too late to participate in the capture of Jerusalem, but he gained valuable experience and saw wonders that few Europeans had ever witnessed. The crusade was a disaster for William personally. His army was ambushed and destroyed. He barely escaped with his life. But the experience did not dim his enthusiasm for adventure. He returned to Aquitaine and threw himself into the life of a great lord. He waged wars against his neighbours. He quarrelled with the church. He lived exactly as he pleased, regardless of what anyone thought. William IX's personal life was scandalous even by the relaxed standards of Aquitaine. He married twice and had numerous affairs. His second wife, Philippa of Toulouse, was a pious and long-suffering woman who endured her husband's infidelities with Christian patience. William openly kept a mistress, a woman called Dangereuse, whom he installed in his castle at Poitiers. The scandal shocked even his tolerant contemporaries. The church threatened him with excommunication, but William cared nothing for such threats. He lived by his own rules. What made William IX truly extraordinary was his poetry. He composed songs in the Occitan language that expressed ideas about love, pleasure, and the human condition. His verses were witty, irreverent, and sometimes bawdy. He wrote about the joys of love and the pleasures of the flesh. He mocked those who disapproved of his lifestyle. He celebrated life with a gusto that leaps off the page even after 900 years. William's poetry established the troubadour tradition that would flourish for the next 2 centuries. He was the first known troubadour, the founder of a literary movement that would transform European culture. His songs were performed at courts throughout southern France and beyond. Other poets imitated his style and expanded on his themes. The tradition he started would influence everything from medieval romances to modern love songs. The personality that emerges from William's poetry is complex and fascinating. He could be crude and boastful. He could also be tender and reflective. He wrote about the pain of rejection as well as the joy of conquest. He showed a self-awareness that was unusual for his time. In one famous poem, he contemplated his own mortality and wondered what would become of his soul. This was a man who thought deeply about life, even as he lived it to the fullest. William IX died in 1126, when Eleanor was a small child. She may have had some memory of him, or she may have known him only through the stories told by others. Either way, his influence on her was profound. She grew up in a court that he had shaped. She inherited his love of poetry and culture. She also inherited his independent spirit and his willingness to defy convention. In many ways, Eleanor was her grandfather's true heir. William IX was succeeded by his son, William X. This was Eleanor's father. He was a very different man from his flamboyant father. William X was more serious, more pious, and more concerned with the responsibilities of rulership. He lacked his father's poetic gifts and his scandalous personal life, but he was a capable ruler who maintained Aquitaine's power and prosperity. William X was born around 1099. He grew up in the shadow of his larger-than-life father. When he inherited the duchy in 1126, he was already a mature man, with experience in warfare and governance. He proved to be a steady, competent ruler. He kept his vassals in line and defended his borders against encroachment. He maintained the cultural traditions of the Aquitaine court, while avoiding the scandals that had marked his father's reign. Eleanor's mother was Eleanor of Châtellerault. She was the daughter of Dangerous, William IX's notorious mistress. This meant that Eleanor's maternal grandmother was the woman who had caused such scandal at the Aquitaine court. The marriage between William X and Eleanor had been arranged by William IX himself. It was a way of legitimizing his relationship with Dangerous and providing for her family. The marriage seems to have been a happy one, producing several children. Eleanor was probably born in 1122, though some sources suggest 1124. The exact date is uncertain, as medieval record-keeping was not precise about such matters. She was born at a location that is also uncertain. Some say she was born in Bordeaux, others in Poitiers. What is certain is that she was born into the highest level of medieval aristocracy. From her first breath, she was destined for a life of power and privilege. Eleanor was not the first child of William X and Eleanor. She had an older brother named William, who was expected to inherit the duchy. As a girl, Eleanor's future seemed clear. She would be married to some great lord, bringing an alliance to her family and perhaps some territory as her dowry. She would bear children and manage a noble household. This was the expected path for a woman of her rank. But fate had other plans. Eleanor's brother William died while still a child. The exact circumstances of his death are not recorded. Perhaps it was illness, perhaps an accident. In an age of high childhood mortality, such losses were tragically common. But this particular loss had enormous consequences. With her brother's death, Eleanor became the heir to Aquitaine. Suddenly Eleanor was no longer just a noble daughter to be married off for political advantage. She was the future ruler of one of the richest territories in Europe. Her marriage would not just bring an alliance, it would bring Aquitaine itself to her husband. This made her the most valuable bride in all of Christendom. Kings and princes would compete for her hand. Her choice of husband would reshape the political map of Europe. Eleanor's childhood was spent in the sophisticated environment of the Aquitaine court. She received an education that was remarkable for a woman of her time. She learned to read and write, skills that many nobles, even men, did not possess. She studied Latin, the language of the church and of learning. She read histories and religious texts. She absorbed the culture of the troubadours, learning to appreciate poetry and music. The court at Poitiers was a lively place during Eleanor's childhood. Troubadours came to perform their songs and seek patronage. Nobles from across Aquitaine gathered to conduct business and socialise. Churchmen came to consult with the Duke on matters of religion and politics. Foreign visitors brought news of distant lands. Eleanor grew up surrounded by interesting people and stimulating conversation. Eleanor's education went beyond books and music. She learned the practical skills needed to run a great household. She learned about managing servants, keeping accounts, and organising supplies. These were essential abilities for a medieval noblewoman. A great lady was expected to manage her household efficiently, especially when her husband was away at war. Eleanor proved to be an apt pupil in these practical matters, as well as in more refined pursuits. Physical activities were also part of Eleanor's upbringing. She learned to ride horses, a skill that would serve her well throughout her adventurous life. Hunting was a common pastime for noble women as well as men, and Eleanor likely participated in hawking and other forms of the chase. These activities built strength and endurance. They also provided opportunities for socializing with other nobles. Eleanor had at least one sibling who survived childhood. Her younger sister, Petronilla, would play an important role in her later life. The two sisters seem to have been close. They shared the experience of growing up in the Aquitaine court, and they would support each other through difficult times. Petronilla's own life would be marked by scandal and controversy, much like Eleanor's. The religious education Eleanor received was typical for her time and class. She learned the teachings of the church and the stories of the Bible. She attended Mass and observed the religious festivals that punctuated the medieval year. But Eleanor's religious views seem to have been somewhat relaxed. She lived in a region where the church's authority was not as absolute as in other parts of Europe. The tolerant atmosphere of Aquitaine may have shaped her attitude toward religion. As Eleanor grew older, her father began to think about her marriage. The heir to Aquitaine could not remain single for long. Too many ambitious lords would see her as a prize to be seized. William X needed to find a husband who could protect Eleanor and her inheritance. He needed someone powerful enough to defend Aquitaine, but not so powerful that he would absorb the duchy entirely. The obvious choice was the King of France. Louis VI, known as Louis the Fat, ruled a kingdom that was theoretically superior to Aquitaine, but actually weaker in many ways. The French royal domain was small, centred on Paris and the surrounding region. The king's authority over his great vassals was limited. By marrying Eleanor to the French heir, William could secure a powerful ally without losing Aquitaine's independence. Negotiations for the marriage began while Eleanor was still a child. These things took time in the medieval world. Agreements had to be reached about dowries, rights, and obligations. The church had to verify that the couple was not too closely related by blood or marriage. All of this required careful diplomacy and patience. While these negotiations proceeded, life at the Aquitaine court continued. Eleanor grew from a child into a young woman. She developed the intelligence, charm, and determination that would mark her throughout her life. Those who met her were impressed by her beauty and her wit. She was clearly an exceptional person, destined for an exceptional life. In 1137, when Eleanor was about 15 years old, her father decided to make a pilgrimage. William X would travel to the shrine of St. James at Compostela in northwestern Spain. This was one of the great pilgrimage destinations of medieval Europe. Thousands of faithful Christians made the journey each year, seeking spiritual merit and the forgiveness of their sins. The pilgrimage was a long and difficult journey. William had to cross the Pyrenees Mountains and travel through the kingdoms of northern Spain. The roads were rough and sometimes dangerous. Bandits preyed on travellers. Illness could strike without warning, but William was determined to make the journey. Perhaps he felt the need for spiritual renewal. Perhaps he simply wanted the adventure. William took Eleanor and Petronilla with him on the first part of the journey. But at some point, he sent the girls back. Perhaps he felt the journey was becoming too dangerous for them. Perhaps he wanted them safe in Aquitaine while he completed his pilgrimage. Whatever the reason, Eleanor returned home while her father continued on. William X never returned from his pilgrimage. He died on Good Friday, April 9th, 1137, at Compostela. He had reached his destination, but he would never see his homeland again. The cause of his death is not recorded. It may have been illness or exhaustion from the journey, or some accident? Medieval sources are frustratingly vague about such details. The news of William's death reached Aquitaine and threw the duchy into uncertainty. Eleanor was now the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. At 15 years old, she was one of the wealthiest and most powerful people in Europe. She was also extremely vulnerable. An unmarried heiress with no father to protect her was a target for every ambitious lord in France. William had anticipated this danger. Before leaving on his pilgrimage, he had made arrangements for Eleanor's protection. He had placed her under the guardianship of the King of France, Louis VI. He had also finalised the marriage agreement between Eleanor and the King's son, Prince Louis. If anything happened to William, Eleanor would have a powerful protector. The old king moved quickly when he learned of William's death. He understood that Eleanor's situation was precarious. Other lords might try to kidnap her and force her into marriage. They might try to seize Aquitaine for themselves. Louis VI had to act fast to secure this prize for his son. The king sent a delegation south to claim Eleanor. This group included some of the most important men in France. They travelled with a military escort, prepared to fight if necessary. Their mission was to bring Eleanor north and marry her to Prince Louis before anyone else could intervene. Eleanor received the French delegation with the dignity expected of a duchess. She was now the ruler of Aquitaine, and she conducted herself accordingly. She agreed to the marriage that her father had arranged. She prepared to leave her homeland and travel north to become Queen of France. The journey north was a grand procession. Eleanor travelled with a large retinue of Aquitaine nobles and servants. She brought with her the wealth and culture of the south. She brought her sister Petronilla, who would accompany her to the French court. She brought troubadours and musicians to entertain her. She brought the refined manners and sophisticated tastes of Aquitaine. The marriage took place on July 25th, 1137, in the Cathedral of Bordeaux. Eleanor was about 15 years old. Prince Louis was 16 or 17. The ceremony united two of the greatest territories in France. It joined the sophisticated south with the more austere north. It brought together two young people who were very different in temperament and outlook. The wedding was a magnificent affair. The cathedral was decorated with flowers and fine fabrics. Nobles from across France gathered to witness the union. The Archbishop of Bordeaux performed the ceremony. Eleanor and Louis exchanged their vows and became husband and wife. At that moment, Eleanor became the future Queen of France. But the wedding was overshadowed by dramatic news. Even as the celebration continued, word arrived that King Louis VI had died. The old king had been ill for some time, and the effort of arranging his son's marriage had exhausted him. He died on August 1st, 1137, just a week after the wedding. This meant that Prince Louis was now King Louis VII, and Eleanor was not just the future queen. She was the Queen of France immediately. At 15 years old, she had become the consort of one of the most important monarchs in Europe. Her life had changed completely in the span of a few weeks. She had lost her father, gained a husband, and become a queen. The speed of these changes would have overwhelmed most people. But Eleanor was not most people. The young royal couple now faced the task of travelling north to Paris. They needed to take possession of the French kingdom and establish their authority. The journey from Bordeaux to Paris was long and slow. Medieval travel was difficult even for royalty. The roads were rough and often muddy. Rivers had to be crossed by ford or ferry. The royal party stopped at castles and abbeys along the way, receiving the homage of local lords and the blessings of churchmen. Eleanor experienced culture shock as she travelled north. The landscape changed as they left Aquitaine behind. The warm, sunny south gave way to cooler, greener lands. The architecture was different. The people spoke differently. The whole atmosphere was more serious and less refined than what Eleanor had known. She was entering a foreign world, even though it was technically the same kingdom. Paris itself was a revelation. The city was the largest in France, a bustling metropolis of perhaps 50,000 people. It sat on an island in the Seine River, with bridges connecting it to the banks on either side. The great cathedral of Notre Dame was under construction, though it would not be completed for many years. The royal palace on the Ile de la Cité was the centre of French government. This would be Eleanor's new home. The palace was nothing like the sunny, comfortable castles of Aquitaine. It was an old fortress, dark and draughty. The rooms were smaller and less elegant than what Eleanor was accustomed to. The whole place had an air of austerity that contrasted sharply with the refined luxury of the south. Eleanor found it gloomy and depressing. She would spend years trying to bring some of Aquitaine's brightness to this sombre place. The French court was also very different from what Eleanor had known. It was dominated by churchmen and serious-minded nobles. The playful, artistic atmosphere of Aquitaine was absent. There were no troubadours singing songs of love. There were no elegant ladies discussing poetry and romance. Instead, there were endless discussions of politics, warfare, and religious matters. Eleanor felt like an exotic bird trapped in a grey cage. King Louis VII was a peculiar husband for a woman like Eleanor. He had been raised to be a monk, not a king. His older brother Philip had been the heir to the throne. Louis had been destined for a career in the church. He had received a religious education and developed a deeply pious temperament. But Philip had died in a riding accident, and Louis had suddenly become the heir. He was pulled from his religious training and thrust into the role of future king. This background shaped Louis's character profoundly. He was devout to the point of obsession. He spent hours in prayer and attended multiple church services each day. He fasted frequently and wore simple clothing beneath his royal robes. He was uncomfortable with the pleasures of the flesh and seemed almost afraid of physical intimacy. This was not the kind of husband who would appreciate Eleanor's vivacious personality and love of life. Louis was also young and inexperienced. He was only 16 or 17 when he became king. He had received little training in warfare or governance. He relied heavily on advisers, particularly the churchmen who had educated him. The most influential of these was Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, a brilliant administrator who had served Louis's father. Suger would guide the young king through the early years of his reign. Eleanor tried to adapt to her new life. She brought some of her Aquitaine attendants with her, including troubadours and musicians. She attempted to introduce some southern culture to the French court. She wore the fashionable clothes of Aquitaine and encouraged other ladies to do the same. She tried to create a more elegant and refined atmosphere in the gloomy palace. But her efforts met with resistance. The conservative churchmen who dominated the French court disapproved of Eleanor's ways. They saw her love of music and poetry as frivolous. They viewed her fashionable clothes as immodest. They whispered that she was a bad influence on the young king. They worried that she was distracting Louis from his duties with her southern ways. Eleanor also faced the challenge of producing an heir. This was the primary duty of a medieval queen. The kingdom needed a son to continue the royal line. But despite the expectations placed upon her, Eleanor did not become pregnant in the early years of her marriage. This failure caused concern at court. It also raised questions about the relationship between Eleanor and Louis. Some wondered if the pious king was neglecting his marital duties. The relationship between Eleanor and Louis was complicated from the start. They were very different people, with very different temperaments. Eleanor was lively, intelligent, and worldly. Louis was serious, devout, and unworldly. She loved music, poetry, and the pleasures of life. He preferred prayer, fasting, and religious contemplation. It is hard to imagine two people less suited to each other. Yet there was also genuine affection between them, at least in the early years. Louis was captivated by Eleanor's beauty and charm. He was devoted to her in his own way. Eleanor, for her part, seems to have tried to be a good wife. She supported Louis in his role as king. She accompanied him on his travels around the kingdom. She fulfilled her ceremonial duties with grace and dignity. Eleanor's sister Petronilla had accompanied her to France. The younger sister found the French court just as alien as Eleanor did. But Petronilla would soon create a scandal that would have far-reaching consequences. She fell in love with Count Raoul of Vermandois, a powerful noble who was one of Louise's closest advisers. The problem was that Raoul was already married. Raoul was so smitten with Petronilla that he sought to annul his existing marriage. He found bishops willing to declare that his first wife was too closely related to him by blood, making their marriage invalid. This was a common tactic in medieval times, as the complex rules about consanguinity meant that almost any marriage could be challenged if one looked hard enough. Raoul's first wife was set aside, and he married Petronilla. But Raoul's first wife had powerful relatives. Her family appealed to the Pope, who declared Raoul's second marriage invalid and excommunicated everyone involved, including the bishops who had performed the annulment. This created a serious diplomatic crisis. Eleanor supported her sister throughout the affair, which put her at odds with the church hierarchy. The scandal damaged Eleanor's reputation and increased the suspicion with which the French clergy viewed her. The Petronilla affair was connected to a larger conflict that would define the early years of Louis's reign. This was the struggle with Count Theobald of Champagne, one of the most powerful nobles in France. Theobald had given shelter to the bishops who had been excommunicated in the Raoul affair. He had also challenged royal authority in other ways. Louis decided to punish Theobald by invading his lands. The campaign against Champagne was brutal. Louis's forces ravaged the countryside, burning villages and destroying crops. The climax came at the town of Vitry-en-Perthois in January 1143. The townspeople, seeking refuge from the royal army, crowded into the local church. They believed that the sacred building would protect them. They were wrong. Louis's soldiers set fire to the church. The flames spread quickly through the wooden structure. The people inside were trapped. Over 1,000 men, women, and children burned to death. The screams of the dying could be heard throughout the town. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. It was a massacre of innocent people, and Louis was responsible. The Vitry massacre haunted Louis for the rest of his life. He had never intended for such a thing to happen. He was horrified when he learned what his soldiers had done. The pious young king was consumed with guilt. He had caused the deaths of innocent Christians, including women and children who had sought sanctuary in a house of God. This was a terrible sin, one that he feared would damn his soul. Eleanor witnessed the change that came over her husband after Vitry. Louis became even more obsessed with religion. He spent more time in prayer and penance. He wore a hair shirt beneath his clothes to mortify his flesh. He sought absolution from the church but could not find peace. The guilt ate at him constantly. He needed to do something dramatic to atone for his sin. The answer came in the form of a crusade. In 1144, the city of Edessa in the Holy Land fell to Muslim forces. This was a major blow to the Crusader states that European Christians had established in the region. Pope Eugenius III called for a new crusade to recapture Edessa and defend the remaining Christian territories. The great preacher Bernard of Clairvaux travelled through Europe, inspiring thousands to take the cross. Louis saw the crusade as his chance for redemption. By fighting for Christ in the Holy Land, he could atone for the massacre at Vitry. He could wash away his sins with the blood of infidels. He announced his intention to join the crusade with great enthusiasm. He would lead the French forces personally to the Holy Land. Eleanor made a decision that shocked everyone. She announced that she would accompany her husband on the crusade. This was almost unprecedented. Crusading was men's work, dangerous and difficult. The journey to the Holy Land was thousands of miles long, across hostile territory and treacherous seas. No queen had ever attempted such a thing, but Eleanor was determined to go. Her reasons for this decision are not entirely clear. Perhaps she wanted to support her husband in his moment of crisis. Perhaps she was bored with life at the French court and longed for adventure. Perhaps she wanted to see the exotic lands of the East that she had heard about in stories and songs. Perhaps she simply could not bear to be left behind while her husband went off on a great adventure. Whatever her reasons, Eleanor would not be dissuaded. Eleanor did not just decide to go herself. She encouraged other noble women to join the crusade as well. She recruited a contingent of ladies from Aquitaine to accompany her. These women would bring their own attendants and supplies. They would travel alongside the army, sharing in its dangers and hardships. This was revolutionary. Eleanor was transforming the crusade from a purely military expedition into something more complex. The preparations for the crusade took months. An army of this size required enormous amounts of supplies. Food, weapons, horses, tents, and countless other necessities had to be gathered. Ships had to be arranged for the sea crossing. Alliances had to be negotiated with the rulers whose lands the Crusaders would pass through. It was a massive logistical undertaking. Eleanor used the time to put her affairs in order. She made arrangements for the governance of Aquitaine during her absence. She gathered her household and prepared them for the long journey ahead. She acquired suitable clothing and equipment for the expedition. She was determined to travel in style, even on a crusade. The crusade departed in the summer of 1147. It was one of the largest military expeditions of the medieval period. Tens of thousands of soldiers, along with their horses, servants, and camp followers, set out from France. They would travel overland through Germany and Hungary, then through the Byzantine Empire to Constantinople. From there, they would cross into Asia Minor and make their way to the Holy Land. The crusading army that left France in 1147 was an impressive sight. Thousands of knights in gleaming armour rode at its head. Behind them came foot soldiers, archers, and men-at-arms. Wagons loaded with supplies stretched for miles along the road. Servants, craftsmen, and camp followers added to the throng. And among all these people rode Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, determined to see the Holy Land with her own eyes. The journey began with high hopes and great enthusiasm. The Crusaders believed they were doing God's work. They had taken vows to fight for Christ and liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. Preachers had promised them that their sins would be forgiven if they died in this sacred cause. They set out with songs on their lips and faith in their hearts. Eleanor travelled in considerable comfort, at least by medieval standards. She had her own tent, her own servants, and her own supplies. She was accompanied by her ladies-in-waiting, those noble women from Aquitaine who had answered her call to join the crusade. These women brought a touch of elegance to the rough military camp. They wore fine clothes and maintained their beauty routines even on the march. The presence of women on the crusade was controversial. Many churchmen disapproved strongly. They believed that women were a distraction and a temptation. They worried that the soldiers would be more concerned with impressing the ladies than with fighting the enemy. They grumbled that Eleanor and her companions were turning a holy war into a pleasure trip. These criticisms would grow louder as the crusade progressed. The first leg of the journey took the Crusaders through Germany. The German king, Conrad III, had also taken the cross. His army had departed before the French and was travelling ahead of them. The two armies would meet in Constantinople before crossing into Asia. The route through Germany was relatively easy. The roads were decent, and the local people were friendly to the Crusaders. Hungary was the next country on the route. The Hungarian king allowed the Crusaders to pass through his lands peacefully. He provided markets where the army could buy food and supplies. The Hungarians were fellow Christians, and they supported the crusade, even if they were not joining it themselves. The passage through Hungary went smoothly. The Byzantine Empire presented more challenges. The Byzantines were Christians, but they followed the Eastern Orthodox faith rather than the Roman Catholic faith of the Crusaders. There had been tensions between Eastern and Western Christians for centuries. The Byzantines viewed the Crusaders with suspicion. They remembered the violence and looting that had accompanied the First Crusade 50 years earlier. The Crusaders, for their part, were amazed by the Byzantine Empire. Nothing in Western Europe could compare to its wealth and sophistication. The roads were better maintained. The cities were larger and more magnificent. The level of civilization was far beyond what the Crusaders knew at home. They felt like country bumpkins visiting a great metropolis. Constantinople was the crown jewel of the Byzantine Empire. It was the largest city in the Christian world, with a population of perhaps 500,000 people. Its walls were legendary, having withstood countless sieges over the centuries. Its churches were filled with treasures and holy relics. Its markets offered goods from every corner of the known world. The Crusaders had never seen anything like it. Eleanor was particularly impressed by Constantinople. She had grown up in the sophisticated environment of Aquitaine, but even she was dazzled by the Byzantine capital. The palace of the emperor was more magnificent than anything in France. The gardens were beautiful beyond description. The art and architecture showed a level of refinement that Western Europe could not match. Eleanor absorbed everything she saw with eager eyes. The Byzantine emperor Manuel Comnenus received the Crusaders with elaborate ceremony. He was a sophisticated ruler who understood how to impress his visitors. He hosted lavish banquets and entertainments. He showed off the treasures of his empire. He was charming and gracious to his guests, but beneath the surface he was deeply suspicious of their intentions. Manuel had good reason to be wary. The Crusaders were a large armed force passing through his territory. They had already caused problems, with some soldiers looting and fighting with local people. Manuel wanted them out of his empire as quickly as possible. He provided them with supplies and transportation across the Bosphorus Strait, but he was relieved to see them go. Eleanor spent several weeks in Constantinople, and she made an impression on the Byzantine court. The emperor and his courtiers were intrigued by this Western queen who had travelled so far from home. She was beautiful, intelligent, and cultured. She could hold her own in conversation with the sophisticated Byzantines. Some sources suggest that Manuel was particularly charmed by her, though the exact nature of their interaction is unclear. The Crusaders crossed into Asia Minor in the autumn of 1147. This was where the real dangers began. Asia Minor was controlled by the Seljuk Turks, Muslim warriors who were hostile to the Christian invaders. The terrain was rugged and difficult. Water and food were scarce. The Crusaders were entering enemy territory, and they would have to fight their way through. The German army under Conrad had crossed first, and they had met with disaster. The Turks had ambushed them in the mountains and inflicted terrible losses. Conrad himself was wounded. The survivors straggled back to the coast, their army shattered. This was an ominous sign for the French Crusaders who followed. Louis decided to take a different route than the Germans had taken. He led his army along the coast, hoping to avoid the mountains where Conrad had been ambushed. This route was longer, but seemed safer. The army made slow progress, hampered by the difficult terrain and the constant threat of Turkish attack. The Turks harassed the Crusaders constantly. They did not engage in pitched battles. Instead, they used hit-and-run tactics. Turkish horse archers would sweep down on the column, loose a volley of arrows, and then gallop away before the Crusaders could respond. These attacks caused steady casualties and kept the army in a constant state of tension. The crossing of Mount Cadmos in January 1148 was a turning point. The army was strung out along a narrow mountain path. The vanguard, commanded by Eleanor's uncle, Raymond of Antioch's vassal, Geoffrey of Rancon, pushed ahead and made camp on the far side of the mountain. This left the rest of the army exposed on the dangerous slopes. The Turks attacked in force. They caught the Crusaders in a vulnerable position and inflicted devastating losses. Thousands of soldiers were killed. Equipment and supplies were lost. The army was thrown into chaos. Louis himself barely escaped with his life, fighting off attackers with his sword and hiding in a rocky outcrop until the battle ended. Eleanor was with the baggage train during the attack. The danger she faced was very real. If the Turks had broken through completely, she could have been killed or captured. The thought of the Queen of France falling into Muslim hands was terrifying. It would have been a disaster of epic proportions. Fortunately, Eleanor survived the battle unharmed. The disaster at Mount Cadmos was blamed on Geoffrey of Rancon, who had disobeyed orders by pushing ahead. But some blamed Eleanor as well. They said that the baggage train, loaded with the luxuries that Eleanor and her ladies required, had slowed the army down. They claimed that the women's presence had weakened the army's discipline and fighting spirit. These accusations were probably unfair, but they stuck to Eleanor nonetheless. The shattered army limped on toward Antioch. They had lost thousands of men and much of their equipment. Morale was low. Many crusaders were sick or wounded. The grand expedition that had left France with such high hopes was now a battered remnant. But they pressed on, driven by faith and determination. Antioch was a welcome sight after the horrors of the march. The city was one of the great Crusader states, ruled by Eleanor's uncle Raymond of Poitiers. Raymond was Eleanor's father's younger brother. He had come to the East as a young man and had married the heiress of Antioch, becoming its prince. He was handsome, charming, and cultured. He welcomed his niece warmly. The Crusaders rested in Antioch, recovering from their ordeal. Raymond provided them with food, shelter, and medical care. He entertained them with feasts and entertainments. After the hardships of the march, Antioch seemed like paradise. The Crusaders relaxed and regained their strength. Eleanor was delighted to be reunited with her uncle. Raymond was everything that Louis was not. He was worldly, sophisticated, and fun. He loved music and poetry. He appreciated Eleanor's intelligence and wit. The two of them spent hours together, talking and laughing. They shared the culture of Aquitaine, speaking in their native tongue and reminiscing about their homeland. The closeness between Eleanor and Raymond caused scandal. People began to whisper that their relationship was improper. Some suggested that they were having an affair. These rumours were probably false. Raymond was Eleanor's uncle, and such a relationship would have been considered incestuous by medieval standards. But the gossip spread nonetheless, damaging Eleanor's reputation. Raymond had his own agenda for the crusade. He wanted the Crusaders to attack Aleppo, the Muslim stronghold that threatened Antioch. This made strategic sense from his perspective. Aleppo was the main threat to his principality. If it could be captured, Antioch would be secure for generations. Raymond lobbied hard for this plan. But Louis had different ideas. He had come to the Holy Land to visit Jerusalem and pray at the holy sites. He was not interested in Raymond's local political concerns. He wanted to fulfill his crusading vow by visiting the places where Christ had walked. The disagreement between Louis and Raymond grew heated. Eleanor sided with her uncle. She thought Raymond's plan made military sense. She may also have simply enjoyed being in Antioch and wanted to stay longer. She argued with Louis, urging him to support Raymond's strategy. This was a serious breach of wifely obedience. A medieval queen was expected to support her husband, not contradict him publicly. The argument between Louis and Eleanor reached a breaking point. Eleanor reportedly threatened to seek an annulment of their marriage. She claimed that they were too closely related by blood, making their marriage invalid. This was a stunning threat. If Eleanor left Louis, she would take Aquitaine with her. The French king would lose the richest territory in his realm. Louis was shocked and furious. He had always been devoted to Eleanor, despite their differences. The suggestion that she would leave him was devastating, but he was also determined not to give in to her demands. He would not let his wife dictate his military strategy. He decided to leave Antioch immediately and continue to Jerusalem. What happened next is one of the most dramatic moments in Eleanor's life. According to some sources, Louis had Eleanor seized in the middle of the night. His soldiers took her from her quarters and placed her under guard. She was essentially kidnapped by her own husband. The crusading army left Antioch before dawn, taking Eleanor with them against her will. The relationship between Louis and Eleanor never recovered from this incident. Whatever affection had existed between them was destroyed. Eleanor had been humiliated and treated like a prisoner. Louis had shown a ruthless side that surprised everyone who knew him. The marriage was now a hollow shell, held together only by political necessity. The Crusaders continued to Jerusalem, where Louis finally fulfilled his vow. He prayed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site where Christ was believed to have been buried and resurrected. He visited other holy sites and performed the devotions expected of a pilgrim. For Louis, this was the true purpose of the crusade. The military objectives were secondary to his spiritual goals. A council was held at Acre to decide the crusade's next move. The leaders debated various strategies. In the end, they decided to attack Damascus, one of the great Muslim cities of the region. This was a puzzling choice. Damascus had actually been friendly to the Crusader states, serving as a buffer against more aggressive Muslim powers. Attacking it would turn a potential ally into an enemy. The siege of Damascus was a fiasco. The Crusaders arrived at the city and began their assault. At first they made progress, capturing the orchards outside the city walls. But then they made a fatal mistake. They moved their camp to a less favourable position, apparently on the advice of local Crusader lords, who had their own political reasons. The new position had no water and no shade. The Crusaders began to suffer. Muslim reinforcements were approaching. The Crusaders realised that they could not take the city before these forces arrived. They would be trapped between the city walls and the relief army. Reluctantly, they decided to withdraw. The siege had lasted only 4 days. It was a humiliating failure. The Second Crusade was over. It had accomplished nothing. Edessa remained in Muslim hands. No territory had been gained. Thousands of crusaders had died, either in battle or from disease and hardship. The great expedition that had set out with such high hopes had ended in total failure. Louis and Eleanor began the long journey home. The return journey was made by sea. The royal couple sailed from the Holy Land to Sicily, then continued along the Italian coast. The voyage was dangerous. At one point, their ship was attacked by Byzantine vessels. The Byzantines had turned hostile, angry about the Crusaders' behaviour in their territory. Louis and Eleanor barely escaped capture. They stopped in Italy and met with Pope Eugenius III. The Pope was concerned about the state of their marriage. He had heard the rumours about Eleanor and Raymond. He knew about the threat of annulment. He tried to reconcile the royal couple, urging them to put aside their differences and work together for the good of the kingdom. Eugenius went so far as to personally arrange for Louis and Eleanor to share a bed. He decorated a chamber with luxurious furnishings and insisted that they spend the night together. His hope was that physical intimacy would rekindle their affection. Perhaps it would also result in the conception of an heir, which would bind them together more firmly. The Pope's intervention seemed to work, at least temporarily. Louis and Eleanor left Italy on better terms than they had arrived. Eleanor soon became pregnant. This was welcome news after years of hoping for an heir. Perhaps the marriage could be saved after all. Perhaps the disasters of the Crusade could be put behind them. Eleanor gave birth in 1150, but the child was a girl, not the son that everyone had hoped for. She was named Marie and would grow up to be an important figure in her own right. But at the time, her birth was a disappointment. The kingdom still needed a male heir. Eleanor had failed once again to provide one. The years following the Second Crusade were difficult ones for Eleanor and Louis. The failure of the Crusade hung over them like a cloud. The rumours about Eleanor's behaviour in Antioch continued to circulate. The lack of a male heir remained a pressing concern, and the fundamental incompatibility between the two of them became more and more apparent. Louis tried to be a good husband in his own way. He was faithful to Eleanor, unlike many medieval kings who kept mistresses openly. He showed her respect and deference in public. He relied on her judgment in many matters, but he could not give her what she truly needed. He could not be the partner she wanted. His piety and seriousness were suffocating to a woman of Eleanor's temperament. Eleanor, for her part, grew increasingly frustrated. She was trapped in a marriage that brought her no joy. She was stuck in a court that disapproved of everything she valued. She was expected to produce sons, but her body would not cooperate. She was one of the most powerful women in Europe, yet she felt powerless to control her own destiny. The court at Paris remained as gloomy as ever. The influence of Abbot Suger had waned after his death in 1151, but other churchmen took his place. They continued to view Eleanor with suspicion. They blamed her for the failures of the Crusade. They whispered that she was a bad influence on the king. Eleanor had few friends in this hostile environment. Eleanor found some consolation in her role as Duchess of Aquitaine. She still held her ancestral lands, and she took an active interest in their governance. She corresponded with her officials in the south. She made decisions about appointments and policies. Aquitaine remained her true home, even though she rarely visited it. The connection to her homeland gave her a sense of identity and purpose. The question of the succession became more urgent as the years passed. Louis was approaching 30, and he still had no son. His only child was the Princess Marie, who could not inherit the throne under French law. If Louis died without a male heir, the crown would pass to a distant relative. This would be a disaster for the kingdom and for the royal family. Eleanor became pregnant again in 1150. The court waited anxiously to see if this child would be the long-awaited son. Once again, Eleanor went through the dangers of medieval childbirth. Once again, she delivered a healthy baby. And once again, the child was a girl. This second daughter was named Alix. She would later become Countess of Blois. The birth of another daughter deepened the crisis. Louis and Eleanor had been married for over 13 years. They had produced only 2 daughters. There was no reason to believe that Eleanor would ever bear a son. The marriage that had begun with such promise now seemed like a failure. Something had to change. The idea of annulment began to be discussed more openly. In the medieval church, divorce, as we understand it, did not exist. Marriage was a sacrament that could not be dissolved. But marriages could be annulled, declared invalid from the beginning, if certain conditions were met. The most common grounds for annulment were consanguinity, meaning that the couple was too closely related by blood. Louis and Eleanor were indeed related. They were both descendants of Robert II of France, who had lived over a century earlier. By the complex rules of medieval canon law, this made them cousins within the prohibited degrees. Their marriage should never have been allowed in the first place. Of course, this relationship had been known at the time of their wedding. The church had granted a dispensation allowing them to marry despite it. but dispensations could be reconsidered. Annulments could be granted. The decision to seek an annulment was not made lightly. It would have enormous political consequences. Eleanor would take Aquitaine with her when she left. The French crown would lose its richest territory. All the advantages that Louis VI had gained by arranging this marriage would be thrown away. It was a heavy price to pay, but there were arguments in favour of annulment as well. Louis needed a son, and Eleanor seemed unable to give him one. Perhaps with a different wife, he would have better luck. Eleanor was also a constant source of controversy and scandal. Her presence at court created tensions that distracted from governance. Maybe everyone would be better off if the marriage ended. The discussions about annulment continued for months. Louis was torn. He still had feelings for Eleanor, despite everything that had happened. He did not want to lose her or the land she brought, but he also recognised that their marriage was not working. He needed an heir, and Eleanor could not provide one. In the end, practical considerations won out over sentiment. On March 21st, 1152, a council of French bishops met at Beaugency. They heard testimony about the relationship between Louis and Eleanor. They examined the genealogical evidence. They concluded that the couple was indeed related within the prohibited degrees. The marriage was declared null and void. Louis and Eleanor were no longer husband and wife. The terms of the annulment were remarkably favourable to Eleanor. She regained full control of Aquitaine. Her daughters would remain with Louis, as was customary, but Eleanor would retain her title and her lands. She was free to remarry if she chose. At about 30 years old, she was once again the most eligible woman in Europe. Eleanor left Paris immediately after the annulment. She had no desire to linger in a place that had brought her so little happiness. She headed south, back to her beloved Aquitaine. The journey was dangerous. An unmarried heiress travelling with valuable lands was a tempting target. At least 2 lords attempted to ambush Eleanor and force her into marriage. She evaded them both through quick thinking and fast riding. Eleanor reached Aquitaine safely and took up residence in Poitiers. She was home at last, back in the land of sunshine and troubadours. She was free from her unhappy marriage and free from the gloomy French court. She could live as she pleased and rule her duchy as she saw fit. It must have been an exhilarating feeling. But Eleanor had no intention of remaining single for long. She had already chosen her next husband. She'd met him before, during the annulment negotiations. He was young, ambitious, and handsome. He was the heir to vast territories that would make him one of the most powerful men in Europe. His name was Henry Plantagenet, and he would change Eleanor's life forever. Henry Plantagenet was unlike anyone Eleanor had ever met. He was 11 years younger than her, only 19 years old when they first became acquainted, but he had a presence and an energy that made him seem older. He was restless, always moving, always planning, always scheming. He had red hair and grey eyes that seemed to see everything. He was destined for greatness, and he knew it. Henry's background was as impressive as Eleanor's own. His mother was Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England. Matilda had fought a long civil war for the English throne against her cousin Stephen. The war had ended in a compromise. Stephen would remain king for his lifetime, but Henry would succeed him. This meant that Henry was the heir to England. But England was only part of Henry's inheritance. His father, Geoffrey of Anjou, had conquered the Duchy of Normandy. When Geoffrey died in 1151, Henry inherited Normandy and the county of Anjou. He was already one of the most powerful lords in France, controlling territories that stretched from the English Channel to the Loire River. If he married Eleanor, he would add Aquitaine to his domains. The combination was staggering. Henry plus Eleanor would control more of France than the King of France himself. Their territories would stretch from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. They would be the dominant power in Western Europe. It was an alliance that would reshape the political landscape for generations. Eleanor and Henry had met at the French court while Eleanor was still married to Louis. The exact circumstances of their meeting are unclear, but they clearly made an impression on each other. Henry was attracted to Eleanor's beauty, intelligence, and power. Eleanor was attracted to Henry's energy, ambition, and potential. They recognized in each other a kindred spirit. Some historians believe that Eleanor and Henry began their relationship while she was still married to Louis. This would explain the speed with which they married after her annulment. It would also add another layer of scandal to Eleanor's already controversial reputation. Whether or not they were lovers before her marriage ended, they certainly wasted no time afterward. Eleanor and Henry were married on May 18, 1152, just 8 weeks after her annulment from Louis. The wedding took place in Poitiers, in Eleanor's own cathedral. It was a hasty ceremony, without the elaborate preparations that usually accompanied royal weddings. They did not seek permission from Louis, their feudal overlord, as custom required. They simply married and presented the world with a fait accompli. The news of the marriage shocked Europe. Louis was furious. He had just lost Aquitaine, and now it was being joined to the territories of his most dangerous rival. The balance of power in France had shifted dramatically against him. He considered going to war to prevent this union, but he lacked the strength to challenge Henry directly. The marriage between Eleanor and Henry was a partnership of equals in a way that her marriage to Louis had never been. Henry respected Eleanor's intelligence and valued her counsel. He trusted her to govern in his absence. He treated her as a partner rather than a subordinate. This was what Eleanor had always wanted, and she flourished in this new relationship. Eleanor was also physically attracted to Henry in a way she had never been to Louis. Henry was vigorous and passionate. He had a legendary appetite for life in all its forms. He ate heartily, drank deeply, and pursued women with enthusiasm. He was constantly in motion, riding from one end of his domains to the other, never staying in one place for long. His energy was infectious. People around him were swept up in his restless drive. Henry's physical appearance was striking. He had the red hair common to his family, the Plantagenets. His eyes were grey and piercing, seeming to take in everything at once. He was of medium height but powerfully built, with broad shoulders and strong legs developed from years of riding. His hands were rough and calloused from handling weapons and reins. He dressed simply, preferring practical clothing to elaborate finery. The contrast with Louis could not have been more complete. Where Louis was pious, Henry was worldly. Where Louis was hesitant, Henry was decisive. Where Louis spent hours in prayer, Henry spent hours in council, planning and scheming. Louis had been raised to be a monk. Henry had been raised to be a king. The difference showed in everything they did. Eleanor found herself energized by her new husband. The years of frustration and boredom at the French court fell away. She was once again the vibrant, active woman she had been in her youth. She threw herself into her new role with enthusiasm. She would be Henry's partner in building an empire. The early months of their marriage were happy ones. Eleanor and Henry travelled together through their domains, showing themselves to their subjects and receiving homage from their vassals. They visited Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. Everywhere they went, they were received with celebration. The people recognised that a new power had arisen in France. Eleanor became pregnant almost immediately after her marriage. This was a relief after her difficulties with Louis. Perhaps the problem had been with him, not with her. Perhaps she simply needed a different husband to fulfil her destiny as a mother of kings. Whatever the reason, Eleanor's fertility with Henry would prove remarkable. The couple's first child was born in 1153. It was a son named William, after Eleanor's father and grandfather. The birth of a male heir was cause for celebration. Henry now had someone to inherit his growing empire. Eleanor had proven that she could bear sons. The future of the Plantagenet dynasty seemed secure. But the joy was short-lived. Little William died in 1156, when he was only 3 years old. The cause of his death is not recorded. Childhood mortality was tragically common in the medieval period. Even royal children, with access to the best care available, often did not survive. Eleanor and Henry mourned their firstborn son, but they had to move forward. Fortunately, Eleanor had already given birth to another son. Henry, named after his father, was born in 1155. He would be known as Henry the Young King, to distinguish him from his father. This second son would inherit the throne if anything happened to his older brother. When William died, young Henry became the heir apparent. Eleanor continued to bear children at a remarkable rate. After Henry came Matilda in 1156, named after Henry's mother. Then came Richard in 1157, the future Richard the Lionheart. Geoffrey followed in 1158. Eleanor was born in 1161, named after her mother. Joanna came in 1165, and finally John in 1166. In total, Eleanor bore Henry 8 children who survived infancy. This was an extraordinary achievement for any woman, let alone one who had struggled to conceive with her first husband. The rapid succession of pregnancies must have been exhausting for Eleanor. Medieval childbirth was dangerous, and each pregnancy carried the risk of death. But Eleanor survived them all and remained healthy and active. Her constitution was clearly robust. She had inherited the strength and vitality of her Aquitaine ancestors. While Eleanor was bearing children, Henry was building an empire. In 1154, King Stephen of England died, and Henry claimed the throne as agreed. He crossed the English Channel and was crowned King Henry II at Westminster Abbey on December 19th, 1154. Eleanor was crowned alongside him as Queen of England. She had achieved what no other woman had done. She had been queen of 2 different kingdoms. The Angevin Empire, as historians would later call it, was now complete. Henry ruled England, Normandy, Anjou, and through Eleanor Aquitaine. His territories stretched from the border of Scotland to the Pyrenees Mountains. He controlled more land than any English king before him. He was one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Governing this vast empire was an enormous challenge. Henry had to constantly travel between his different territories, settling disputes, enforcing his authority, and defending his borders. He spent more time in France than in England, because his French lands were more vulnerable to attack. The King of France, Louis VII, remained hostile and looked for any opportunity to weaken his rival. Eleanor played a crucial role in governing the empire. When Henry was in England, she often remained in France to oversee affairs there. When he was in France, she might be in England. They worked as a team, dividing the responsibilities of rulership between them. Eleanor issued charters, held courts, and made decisions in Henry's name. She was not just a consort, she was a ruler in her own right. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by success after success. He restored order to England after the chaos of Stephen's reign. He reformed the legal system, creating institutions that would endure for centuries. He extended his influence into Wales and Ireland. He forced the King of Scotland to acknowledge his overlordship. Everything he touched seemed to turn to gold. Henry's relationship with the church was more complicated. He wanted to extend royal authority over the clergy, limiting their independence and subjecting them to royal courts. This brought him into conflict with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket had been Henry's friend and chancellor, but he became a fierce defender of church privileges after his appointment as Archbishop. The conflict between Henry and Becket dragged on for years. Becket went into exile in France, where he enjoyed the protection of King Louis. He excommunicated Henry's supporters and threatened to place England under interdict. The dispute became an international scandal, embarrassing Henry and undermining his authority. The crisis came to a head in December 1170. Henry, frustrated beyond endurance, reportedly exclaimed that he wished someone would rid him of the troublesome priest. 4 of his knights took this as a command. They travelled to Canterbury and murdered Becket in his own cathedral. The archbishop died before the altar, his blood staining the sacred stones. The murder of Becket was a catastrophe for Henry. The archbishop was immediately hailed as a martyr. Miracles were reported at his tomb. He was canonised as a saint within 3 years of his death. Henry was blamed throughout Christendom for the murder. He had to do public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and submitting to flogging by the monks. His reputation never fully recovered. Eleanor's role during the Becket affair is unclear. She was occupied with her own concerns, particularly the governance of Aquitaine and the raising of her children. She may have had opinions about the conflict, but she kept them to herself. The murder of Becket was Henry's crisis, not hers. As the years passed, Eleanor spent more and more time in Aquitaine. She established her own court at Poitiers, separate from Henry's itinerant household. This court became a centre of culture and refinement, famous throughout Europe for its elegance and sophistication. Eleanor was creating a world of her own, a world that reflected her values and her tastes. The court at Poitiers was unlike anything else in medieval Europe. It was dominated by women in a way that other courts were not. Eleanor gathered around her a circle of noble ladies, including her daughters and her daughters-in-law. These women set the tone for the court, determining what was fashionable and what was acceptable. Men were welcome, but they had to conform to the standards the women established. The troubadour tradition that Eleanor had grown up with flourished at Poitiers. Poets and musicians came from all over southern France to perform at her court. They composed songs praising Eleanor's beauty and virtue. They sang of love and chivalry, of noble knights and fair ladies. The atmosphere was romantic and refined, a world away from the harsh realities of medieval politics and warfare. Eleanor patronised some of the greatest troubadours of the age. Bernard de Ventadorn, perhaps the most famous troubadour of all, was associated with her court. His songs of unrequited love were masterpieces of the genre. Some of them may have been addressed to Eleanor herself, though this is uncertain. What is certain is that Eleanor appreciated his talent and rewarded him generously. The concept of courtly love reached its fullest expression at Eleanor's court. This was the idea that love was a noble and ennobling emotion, that a knight should devote himself to a lady and serve her faithfully. The lady was placed on a pedestal, almost worshipped by her admirers. The knight sought to prove his worthiness through noble deeds and refined behaviour. Courtly love was in many ways a game, a literary convention rather than a description of real relationships. But it had real effects on how people thought about love and marriage. It gave women a new kind of power, at least in theory. It established standards of behaviour that men were expected to follow. It created a culture of romance that would influence European literature for centuries. Eleanor's daughter Marie of Champagne was particularly associated with the development of courtly love. Marie had married Henry, Count of Champagne, and established her own brilliant court there. She patronised the poet Chrétien de Troyes, who wrote the first Arthurian romances in French. These stories of King Arthur and his knights, of Lancelot and Guinevere, of the quest for the Holy Grail, were shaped by the ideals of courtly love. Some sources describe something called the Courts of Love at Poitiers. According to these accounts, Eleanor and her ladies would sit in judgment on questions of love and romance. Lovers would bring their disputes before the court, and the ladies would render verdicts based on the rules of courtly love. These proceedings were supposedly recorded in a book by Andreas Capellanus, a chaplain at Marie's court. Historians debate whether the courts of love actually existed or were simply a literary invention. The evidence is ambiguous. It is possible that Eleanor and her ladies did engage in such entertainments, perhaps as a kind of elaborate game. It is also possible that Andreas Capellanus invented the whole thing to illustrate his theories about love. Either way, the idea of the courts of love captured the imagination of later generations. The court at Poitiers was also a place of education. Eleanor's children spent time there, learning the manners and skills expected of noble men and women. Young Richard, Eleanor's favourite son, was particularly influenced by his time in Aquitaine. He absorbed the culture of the troubadours and developed a love of poetry and music that he would carry throughout his life. Eleanor's relationship with her children was complex. She clearly had favourites, and Richard was chief among them. He was the most like her in temperament, bold and passionate and cultured. She groomed him to inherit Aquitaine, teaching him to love the land and its people. Richard would always be more Aquitanian than English, and this was Eleanor's doing. Her relationship with her oldest surviving son, young Henry, was more distant. Henry was his father's heir, destined to inherit England and Normandy. He spent more time with his father than with his mother. He was charming and popular, but also shallow and easily influenced. Eleanor may have recognised his weaknesses and loved him less for them. Geoffrey, the third son, was clever and ambitious, but also devious and untrustworthy. He would prove to be a troublemaker throughout his life. John, the youngest son, was Eleanor's least favourite. He had been born when she was already in her 40s, and she seems to have had little maternal feeling for him. John would grow up to be one of England's most notorious kings. The daughters received less attention in the historical record, as was typical for medieval women. Matilda was married to Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, and became an important figure in German politics. Eleanor the younger was betrothed to the King of Castile. Joanna was married to the King of Sicily. These marriages were diplomatic tools, binding foreign rulers to the Plantagenet family. While Eleanor was building her court at Poitiers, her relationship with Henry was deteriorating. The passionate partnership of their early years had cooled. Henry was constantly travelling, constantly busy with the affairs of his empire. Eleanor saw him less and less frequently. They were growing apart physically and emotionally. Henry's infidelities were a major source of tension. He had always had a roving eye, and he made little effort to hide his affairs. He fathered several illegitimate children by various mistresses. Eleanor had tolerated this behaviour in the early years of their marriage, as most medieval queens did. But as she grew older and her own position became more secure, she became less willing to overlook her husband's wanderings. The most famous of Henry's mistresses was Rosamond Clifford, known to history as Fair Rosamond. She was a young woman of noble birth, renowned for her beauty. Henry's relationship with her was unusually public and long-lasting. He seemed genuinely attached to her in a way that he had not been to his other mistresses. This made her a particular threat to Eleanor. Legends grew up around Fair Rosamond. One story claimed that Henry built a maze at Woodstock Palace to hide her from Eleanor's jealousy. Only he knew the secret of the maze and could find his way to Rosamond's bower at its centre. Another story claimed that Eleanor eventually discovered Rosamond and forced her to choose between a dagger and a bowl of poison. Rosamond chose the poison and died. These legends are almost certainly false. Rosamond actually retired to a convent at Godstow, where she died around 1176. There is no evidence that Eleanor ever harmed her or even met her, but the legends reflect the popular perception of Eleanor as a jealous and vengeful woman. They also reflect the genuine tension that existed in the royal marriage. By the late 1160s, Eleanor and Henry were living largely separate lives. She remained in Aquitaine, ruling her duchy and presiding over her court. He travelled constantly through his other territories, dealing with the endless problems of governance. They communicated by messenger and met occasionally for important occasions. But the partnership that had once united them was effectively over. The separation was not just personal, but political. Eleanor was increasingly aligned with her sons against her husband. The young princes were growing up and demanding power of their own. Henry had promised them territories and titles, but he was reluctant to actually share authority with them. The sons grew frustrated and resentful. Eleanor encouraged their ambitions. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would shake the Angevin Empire to its foundations. Eleanor would have to choose between her husband and her sons. When the moment came, she would not hesitate. She would choose her sons, and she would pay a terrible price for that choice. The year 1170 marked a turning point in the Plantagenet family. Henry the young king, Eleanor's oldest surviving son, was crowned as his father's co-ruler. This was an unusual arrangement, borrowed from French practice. The idea was to secure the succession by having the heir crowned during the father's lifetime. Young Henry was anointed and crowned at Westminster Abbey, becoming a king in his own right, but the coronation created as many problems as it solved. Young Henry now had the title of king, but he had no real power. His father kept firm control of the government and gave his son no meaningful role. Young Henry was a king in name only, a figurehead without authority. This situation bred resentment and frustration. Young Henry was a charming and popular figure. He was handsome, generous, and skilled at the chivalric arts. Knights flocked to his banner, attracted by his personality and his potential. He kept a magnificent household and lived in a style befitting a king. But all of this was funded by his father, who controlled the purse strings. Young Henry had no independent income and no independent power. The other sons had similar grievances. Richard had been designated as the heir to Aquitaine, but Eleanor still ruled the duchy. Geoffrey had been promised Brittany through his marriage to its heiress, but the marriage had not yet taken place. John, the youngest, had been given nothing at all, earning him the nickname John Lackland. All of the sons felt that their father was holding them back. Henry II's reluctance to share power was understandable. He had built the Angevin Empire through his own efforts, and he was not ready to let it slip from his grasp. He was still vigorous and capable, fully able to rule his domains. Why should he hand over authority to untested young men? He would give them power when he was ready, not when they demanded it. But the sons saw things differently. They were grown men, or nearly so. They had been trained for leadership and were eager to exercise it. They watched their father grow older and wondered when their turn would come. They listened to advisers who whispered that they deserved more. They grew impatient and angry. Eleanor encouraged her son's ambitions. She had her own grievances against Henry. The years of infidelity, the public humiliation of his relationship with Rosamond Clifford, the gradual exclusion from power. She was no longer the partner she had once been. She was increasingly marginalised, pushed aside in favour of younger women and ambitious courtiers. Eleanor's position in Aquitaine gave her a power base independent of Henry. She was the duchess in her own right, and the Aquitaine nobles were loyal to her. If she chose to oppose her husband, she had the resources to do so. This made her dangerous in a way that the sons, who depended on their father for everything, were not. The tensions within the family came to a head in 1173. The immediate cause was a dispute over the castle of Chinon. Henry had given this strategically important fortress to his youngest son John, taking it away from young Henry's nominal control. Young Henry was furious. He had already been humiliated by his powerless position. Now his father was giving away his castles to his baby brother. Young Henry fled from his father's court and took refuge with King Louis VII of France. Louis was delighted to welcome him. The French king had been looking for an opportunity to weaken his Plantagenet rival. Now Henry's own son was offering him that opportunity. Louis promised to support young Henry's claims against his father. Richard and Geoffrey soon joined their brother at the French court. The three oldest sons were now united against their father. They demanded that Henry give them real power over the territories they had been promised. They wanted to rule, not just to hold empty titles. If their father would not grant their demands, they would take what they wanted by force. Eleanor faced a choice. She could remain loyal to her husband and try to mediate the dispute, or she could support her sons in their rebellion. She chose to support her sons. The reasons for this choice were complex. She was angry at Henry for his treatment of her. She believed her sons had legitimate grievances. She may have hoped that a successful rebellion would give her more power and independence. Eleanor did more than just encourage the rebellion. She actively recruited support for it. She used her influence with the Aquitaine nobles to bring them into the conspiracy. She corresponded with other disaffected lords throughout the Angevin Empire. She helped coordinate the plans for a simultaneous uprising across all of Henry's territories. The rebellion of 1173 was the most serious challenge Henry had ever faced. It was not just a local uprising, but a coordinated attack on multiple fronts. In England, the Earl of Leicester raised his banner against the king. In Normandy, the Count of Boulogne invaded. In Aquitaine, the local nobles rose in support of Eleanor and Richard, and behind it all stood the King of France, providing money, troops, and diplomatic support. Henry responded with characteristic energy. He moved quickly to confront the various threats, never allowing his enemies to coordinate their forces. He besieged rebel castles and defeated rebel armies. He showed the military skill that had made him master of an empire. One by one he crushed the centres of resistance. The rebellion in England was suppressed first. The Earl of Leicester was defeated and captured. The Scottish king, who had invaded in support of the rebels, was also captured in a separate engagement. With England secure, Henry could turn his attention to his continental territories. In Normandy and Anjou, Henry's forces gradually gained the upper hand. The rebel lords were isolated and defeated. The French king proved to be a disappointing ally, unwilling to commit his full strength to the conflict. Without French support, the rebellion in the north could not succeed. Aquitaine proved more difficult to subdue. The local nobles were fiercely loyal to Eleanor, and they continued to resist even after the rebellion had failed elsewhere. Richard, though still a teenager, showed the military talent that would later make him famous. He led the Aquitaine forces with skill and courage, but even Aquitaine could not hold out forever. Henry brought overwhelming force to bear on the rebellious duchy. Castle after castle fell to his armies. The rebel lords began to surrender, seeking terms before it was too late. By the autumn of 1174, the rebellion was effectively over. Eleanor had tried to escape during the rebellion. She planned to flee from Poitiers to the French court, where she would be safe from her husband's wrath. She disguised herself as a man, hoping to pass unnoticed through the countryside. But she was recognised and captured by Henry's soldiers. The Queen of England was now a prisoner. The capture of Eleanor was a turning point. Without her leadership, the rebellion in Aquitaine collapsed. The sons, deprived of their mother's guidance and support, were forced to submit to their father. They came before Henry and begged for forgiveness. He granted it, because they were his sons and his heirs. but he did not forgive Eleanor. The terms of the settlement were harsh for the rebels, but not catastrophic. Young Henry was given a larger allowance, but still no real power. Richard was confirmed as the heir to Aquitaine, though he would have to earn his position through loyal service. Geoffrey received Brittany as promised. Even the rebel lords were treated with relative leniency, losing some lands and privileges, but keeping their lives and most of their property. Eleanor received no such mercy. Henry blamed her for the rebellion, and with good reason. She had been its mastermind, the one who had turned his sons against him. She had used her position in Aquitaine to raise an army against her own husband. This was treason of the most personal kind. Henry would never forgive her. Eleanor's imprisonment began in 1174 and would last for 16 years. It was not imprisonment in a dungeon, with chains and darkness. She was kept in various royal castles, treated with the respect due to a queen, but firmly prevented from exercising any power or influence. She was a prisoner nonetheless, stripped of her freedom and her authority. The conditions of Eleanor's captivity varied over the years. Sometimes she was kept in relative comfort, with servants and attendants, and access to the pleasures appropriate to her rank. Other times she was held more strictly, with fewer privileges and less freedom of movement. Henry adjusted her treatment according to his mood and the political situation. The primary location of Eleanor's imprisonment was Salisbury Castle in England. This was a strong fortress, far from Aquitaine and far from anyone who might help her escape. The castle was comfortable enough for a royal residence, but it was also secure. Eleanor could not leave without Henry's permission, and that permission was rarely granted. Eleanor was occasionally brought out for important ceremonial occasions. She appeared at Christmas courts and other major gatherings, displaying the unity of the royal family, even though that unity was a fiction. On these occasions she was treated with all the honours due to a queen, but as soon as the ceremonies were over, she was returned to her confinement. The years of imprisonment must have been difficult for Eleanor. She had always been active and engaged, involved in politics and governance. Now she was forced into idleness, cut off from the world she had known. She could not visit her beloved Aquitaine. She could not see her children, except when Henry permitted it. She could not influence events or exercise her considerable abilities. We know little about how Eleanor spent her time during these years. She probably read, as she was a well-educated woman with a love of literature. She may have done needlework or other crafts considered appropriate for noble women. She certainly prayed, as religious devotion was expected of everyone in the medieval period. But the details of her daily life are lost to history. Eleanor's imprisonment did not mean she was forgotten. Her sons remembered her and resented their father for keeping her locked away. The people of Aquitaine remembered their duchess and wondered when she would return. Troubadours composed songs lamenting her captivity. She remained a figure of fascination and sympathy even in her absence from public life. The world continued to change during Eleanor's imprisonment. Her sons grew to manhood and began to play larger roles in events. Young Henry remained restless and dissatisfied, never reconciled to his powerless position. Richard proved himself a capable military commander, suppressing rebellions in Aquitaine and earning a reputation for courage and skill. Geoffrey involved himself in the complex politics of Brittany and France. Henry II continued to rule his empire, but the years were taking their toll. He was no longer the vigorous young man who had conquered England and built an empire. He was growing old and tired, worn down by constant warfare and family strife. His health began to fail, and his grip on power began to weaken. The death of young Henry in 1183 was a devastating blow. The young king had rebelled against his father again, this time in alliance with disaffected nobles in Aquitaine. He was besieging a castle when he fell ill with dysentery. He died on June 11th, 1183, at the age of 28. His last request was that his father release his mother from captivity. Henry refused. Young Henry's death reshuffled the succession. Richard was now the heir to England, and Normandy, as well as Aquitaine. Geoffrey remained in line for Brittany. John, who had been given Ireland, suddenly became more important as a potential heir if anything happened to Richard. The dynamics within the family shifted, but the fundamental tensions remained. Geoffrey died in 1186, killed in a tournament accident in Paris. He was only 27 years old. His death left behind a pregnant wife, who would give birth to a son named Arthur. This child would later become a rival to John for the English throne. But that conflict lay in the future. Eleanor remained in captivity through all of these events. She learned of her sons' deaths through messengers, unable to comfort them in their final moments or mourn them properly. She watched from afar as her family tore itself apart. She waited and endured, knowing that her time would come eventually. The final years of Henry's reign were marked by conflict with his surviving sons. Richard grew impatient, waiting for his inheritance. He suspected that Henry favoured John and planned to disinherit him. He demanded guarantees of his position that Henry was unwilling to give. Father and son drifted toward open warfare. In 1189, Richard allied with King Philip II of France, who had succeeded his father Louis. Together, they made war on Henry, driving him from one stronghold to another. Henry's health was failing, and he could not mount an effective resistance. His supporters deserted him one by one. Even John, his favourite son, abandoned him for the winning side. Henry died on July 6, 1189, at the castle of Chinon. He was 56 years old, worn out by a lifetime of warfare and betrayal. His last words were reportedly a curse on his sons for their treachery. He was buried at the nearby abbey of Fontevraud, which would become the final resting place for several members of the Plantagenet family. One of Richard's first acts as king was to release his mother from captivity. Eleanor had been imprisoned for 16 years. She was now about 67 years old, an advanced age for the medieval period. Many people expected her to retire quietly and live out her remaining years in peace. They did not know Eleanor. Eleanor emerged from captivity with her energy and determination intact. The years of imprisonment had not broken her spirit. If anything, they had strengthened her resolve. She was free at last, and she intended to make the most of whatever time remained to her. Richard was not yet in England when Eleanor was released. He was still in France, dealing with the aftermath of the war against his father. Eleanor did not wait for him. She immediately began acting on his behalf, securing his kingdom and preparing for his arrival. She travelled throughout England, receiving the homage of nobles and ensuring their loyalty to the new king. Eleanor also took steps to win popular support for Richard's reign. She ordered the release of prisoners from the royal jails. She reduced some of the more oppressive taxes and regulations that had burdened the common people. She presented herself as a merciful queen, bringing relief after the harsh final years of Henry's rule. These actions made her popular and helped smooth Richard's transition to power. Richard arrived in England in August 1189 and was crowned king on September 3rd. Eleanor was present at the coronation, restored to her place of honour after so many years of disgrace. She watched as her favourite son received the crown of England. It must have been a moment of tremendous satisfaction for her. But Richard had little interest in England. His heart was set on crusade. The Holy Land was in crisis. In 1187, the Muslim leader Saladin had defeated the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin and captured Jerusalem. The Christian kingdoms in the east were on the verge of collapse. Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade to recover the Holy City. Richard was determined to lead this crusade. He had taken the cross even before becoming king, vowing to fight for Christ in the Holy Land. Now that he had the resources of a kingdom at his disposal, he threw himself into preparations for the expedition. He raised money through every means available, selling offices, lands, and privileges. He famously said that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. Eleanor supported Richard's crusading plans, even though they meant he would be absent from his kingdom for years. She understood the religious and chivalric motivations that drove him. She also recognized the political benefits of crusading glory. A successful crusade would enhance Richard's reputation throughout Christendom and strengthen his position at home. The question of Richard's marriage became urgent before his departure. He needed an heir to secure the succession. If he died on crusade without children, the crown would pass to John, whom neither Richard nor Eleanor trusted. A marriage and a son would solve this problem. Richard was betrothed to Alice, a French princess who had been raised at the English court. But there were problems with this match. Rumours claimed that Alice had been Henry II's mistress and had even borne him a child. Whether or not these rumours were true, they made the marriage politically impossible. Richard needed a different bride. Eleanor took on the task of finding a suitable wife for her son. She settled on Berengaria of Navarre, the daughter of King Sancho VI. Navarre was a small kingdom in the Pyrenees, strategically located between France and Spain. The marriage would bring a useful alliance and a bride untainted by scandal. Eleanor, now nearly 70 years old, personally travelled across the Alps to fetch Berengaria. This was an extraordinary journey for a woman of her age. The mountain passes were dangerous, even in good weather. The roads were rough and the accommodations primitive, but Eleanor was determined to see her son properly married, and she would let nothing stop her. Eleanor brought Berengaria to Sicily, where Richard had stopped on his way to the Holy Land. The wedding took place in Cyprus in May 1191, after Richard had conquered the island from its rebellious ruler. Eleanor was not present at the ceremony. She had already returned to England to manage affairs there during Richard's absence. Eleanor served as regent of England while Richard was on crusade. This was an enormous responsibility for anyone, let alone an elderly woman who had spent the previous 16 years in captivity. But Eleanor proved more than equal to the task. She governed firmly and wisely, maintaining order and collecting the revenues that Richard needed to fund his expedition. The Third Crusade was a mixed success. Richard won several important victories, including the capture of Acre and a brilliant triumph at the Battle of Arsuf. He proved himself one of the greatest military commanders of the age, earning the nickname Lionheart for his courage in battle. But he failed to recapture Jerusalem. The Holy City remained in Muslim hands. Richard negotiated a truce with Saladin that allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem. This was the best he could achieve, given the circumstances. He had been away from his kingdom for years, and troubling news was reaching him from home. His brother John was plotting against him, trying to seize power with the help of the French king. Richard needed to return to Europe. The journey home proved disastrous. Richard was shipwrecked in the Adriatic and forced to travel overland through hostile territory. He was captured near Vienna by Duke Leopold of Austria, whom he had offended during the Crusade. Leopold turned his valuable prisoner over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who demanded an enormous ransom for Richard's release. The news of Richard's capture reached England in early 1193. Eleanor was devastated. Her beloved son was a prisoner, held by enemies who might never release him. The ransom demanded was staggering: 100,000 marks of silver, equivalent to several years' worth of England's entire royal revenue. It seemed impossible to raise such a sum. Eleanor threw herself into the effort to free her son. She organised the collection of the ransom throughout England. She demanded contributions from nobles, churches, and towns. She melted down church plates and seized treasure wherever it could be found. She wrote letters to the Pope and to other rulers, seeking their support. She did everything in her power to bring Richard home. The ransom was eventually raised, though it took more than a year. Eleanor personally delivered a large portion of it to Germany. She travelled across Europe in the depths of winter, braving the dangers of the journey to bring her son his freedom. When Richard was finally released in February 1194, Eleanor was there to greet him. Richard returned to England briefly before crossing to France to deal with his treacherous brother and the French king. John had allied with Philip Augustus, surrendering Norman castles and plotting to keep Richard imprisoned permanently. When Richard returned, John threw himself at his brother's feet and begged for forgiveness. Richard granted it, reportedly saying that John was a child who had been led astray by bad advisers. The remaining years of Richard's reign were spent fighting to recover the territories that John and Philip had seized during his captivity. Richard proved as formidable in these wars as he had been on crusade. He won battle after battle, pushing Philip back and reclaiming his lost lands. He built the great castle of Château Gaillard to defend Normandy, a masterpiece of military architecture. Eleanor remained active throughout this period, though she was now in her 70s. She continued to advise Richard and to manage affairs in England and Aquitaine. She was the matriarch of the Plantagenet family, respected and even feared by all who knew her. Her energy and determination seemed undiminished by age. Richard died on April 6, 1199, from a wound received while besieging the castle of Châlus-Chabrol in the Limousin region of France. A crossbow bolt had struck him in the shoulder during the siege. The wound became infected, and despite the efforts of surgeons, the infection spread. Richard knew he was dying and sent for his mother. Eleanor rushed to her son's side and was with him when he died. She held him in her arms as he breathed his last. The great warrior king, the Lionheart who had terrified his enemies on battlefields from England to the Holy Land, died in his mother's embrace. He was 41 years old. Eleanor was 77. The grief Eleanor felt at Richard's death must have been overwhelming. He had been her favourite child, the one most like her in spirit and temperament. She had worked tirelessly to free him from captivity. She had supported him through all the challenges of his reign. Now he was gone, and she was left to carry on without him. But Eleanor had no time for prolonged mourning. The succession had to be secured. Richard had died without legitimate children. His marriage to Berengaria had produced no heirs. The crown would pass to one of his brothers, but which one? Geoffrey was long dead, but he had left a son, Arthur of Brittany. John was still alive and eager for the throne. Both had claims and both had supporters. Eleanor threw her support behind John. This might seem surprising given John's history of treachery and his reputation for untrustworthiness, but Eleanor had practical reasons for her choice. John was an adult, experienced in governance and warfare. Arthur was only 12 years old, and his claim would be championed by the King of France, who would use him as a puppet to dismember the Angevin Empire. Eleanor chose the candidate most likely to hold the empire together. John was crowned King of England on May 27, 1199. Eleanor was present at the coronation, watching as her last surviving son received the crown. She had now seen 3 of her sons become kings. 2 of them, young Henry and Richard, had died before her. Only John remained, and Eleanor would spend her final years supporting his troubled reign. Eleanor's official role in English affairs ended with Richard's death, but she continued to wield considerable influence. She was too old and too experienced to be ignored. John relied on her advice and her connections. She was the link to the past, the living memory of the Angevin Empire at its height. Her presence gave legitimacy to John's rule. The most immediate threat to John's position came from Arthur of Brittany. The young duke had the support of King Philip Augustus of France, who recognised him as the rightful heir to Richard's French territories. Philip was eager to break up the Angevin Empire and bring its component parts under French control. Arthur was his tool for achieving this goal. Eleanor took an active role in countering this threat. She travelled to Aquitaine to secure the loyalty of her vassals. She reminded them that she was their duchess, that she had ruled them for decades, and that they owed their allegiance to her and to her chosen heir. The Aquitaine nobles responded to her appeal. They would support John against Arthur and the French king. Eleanor also undertook a remarkable diplomatic mission. She travelled across the Pyrenees to the Kingdom of Castile, where her daughter Eleanor was queen. The purpose of this journey was to select one of her granddaughters to marry the son of King Philip of France. By this marriage, Eleanor hoped to ensure peace between the Plantagenets and the Carpathians. The journey was extraordinary for a woman of Eleanor's age. She was nearly 80 years old, yet she crossed the high mountain passes in the depths of winter. The roads were treacherous, the weather brutal, and the accommodations primitive. A younger person might have hesitated to attempt such a journey. Eleanor pressed on regardless. Eleanor reached the Castilian court and met with her daughter and granddaughters. She had to choose which princess would become the future Queen of France. She selected Blanche, who seemed to have the intelligence and strength of character needed for such an important role. Eleanor's judgment would prove correct. Blanche of Castile would become one of the most capable queens in French history. Eleanor escorted Blanche back across the Pyrenees and delivered her to the French court. The marriage took place and a temporary peace was established between England and France. Eleanor had accomplished her mission. She had used her diplomatic skills one last time to serve her family's interests. But the peace did not last. John's reign was troubled from the beginning. He lacked Richard's military genius and personal charisma. He made enemies easily and friends with difficulty. His treatment of his vassals was often arbitrary and cruel. The great nobles of England and France grew to distrust and despise him. The conflict with Arthur of Brittany came to a head in 1202. Arthur, now 16 years old, invaded Aquitaine with French support. He besieged the castle of Mirebeau, where Eleanor herself was staying. The elderly queen was trapped, surrounded by enemies who sought to capture her and use her as a bargaining chip. John moved with uncharacteristic speed and decisiveness. He force-marched his army to Mirebeau and launched a surprise attack on Arthur's forces. The battle was a complete victory for John. Arthur was captured, along with many of his supporters. Eleanor was rescued from the siege. It was one of the few military triumphs of John's reign. But John squandered the advantages of his victory. He treated his prisoners harshly, alienating potential supporters. Most ominously, Arthur of Brittany disappeared while in John's custody. The young duke was almost certainly murdered on John's orders, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. The murder of Arthur shocked Europe and turned many against John. Eleanor withdrew from public life after the siege of Mirebeau. She retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud, where her husband Henry and her son Richard were buried. She had spent her life in the world of politics and power. Now she sought peace and contemplation in her final days. Fontevraud was a fitting place for Eleanor's retirement. The abbey had been founded in the early 12th century and had become one of the most important religious houses in France. It was unusual in that it housed both monks and nuns, with the entire community under the authority of an abbess. This arrangement appealed to Eleanor, who had always believed in the capabilities of women. Eleanor took the veil at Fontevraud, becoming a nun in her final years. This was a common practice for medieval nobles at the end of their lives. By entering religious life, they hoped to prepare their souls for death and ensure their salvation. Eleanor, who had lived such a worldly life, now turned her thoughts to eternity. The abbey provided Eleanor with comfort and care in her declining years. She was surrounded by the tombs of her family members. She could pray for their souls and contemplate her own mortality. The busy, turbulent life she had led was finally coming to an end. Eleanor of Aquitaine died on April 5th, 1204. She was approximately 82 years old, an extraordinary age for the medieval period. She had outlived 2 husbands, 8 of her 10 children, and countless friends and enemies. She had been queen of 2 kingdoms, duchess of the richest territory in France, and mother of kings. No woman of her era had lived a more remarkable life. Eleanor was buried at Fontevraud beside her husband Henry and her son Richard. Her tomb effigy shows her holding a book, perhaps representing her love of learning and literature. She lies in eternal rest among the family members she had loved and fought with throughout her long life. Eleanor of Aquitaine left a legacy that extended far beyond her own lifetime. She had shaped the history of 2 kingdoms and influenced the culture of all of Europe. Her descendants would rule England for centuries. Her patronage of the arts would inspire generations of poets and musicians. Her example would show what a woman could achieve in a world dominated by men. Eleanor's most immediate legacy was her children and grandchildren. Through them, her blood flowed into the royal houses of Europe. Her son John, despite his many failures, established the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England until 1485. Her daughter Eleanor became Queen of Castile, and her descendants would eventually unite Spain. Her daughter Joanna was Queen of Sicily and later Countess of Toulouse. Her granddaughter Blanche became Queen of France and regent for her son, the saintly Louis IX. The Plantagenet dynasty that Eleanor helped establish would produce some of England's most famous kings. Edward I, the conqueror of Wales and Hammer of the Scots, was her great-great-grandson. Edward III, who began the 100 Years' War with France, descended from her. Even the rival houses of York and Lancaster, whose conflict produced the Wars of the Roses, both traced their lineage back to Eleanor. Eleanor's influence on the culture of medieval Europe was equally significant. She had been the greatest patron of the troubadour tradition, supporting poets and musicians throughout her life. The ideals of courtly love that flourished at her court spread throughout Europe, shaping how people thought about romance and relationships. The literature of chivalry, from the Arthurian romances to the poetry of Dante, bore the imprint of the culture Eleanor had fostered. The court of love that Eleanor allegedly established at Poitiers became legendary. Whether or not it actually existed in the form described by later writers, it represented an ideal of feminine influence and cultural refinement. Eleanor had created a space where women's voices mattered, where their judgments were respected, and where their values shaped behaviour. This was revolutionary for its time. Eleanor also left a legacy as a model of female power and capability. She'd governed Aquitaine, served as regent of England, and influenced the policies of 2 kingdoms. She had shown that a woman could be as capable as any man in the realms of politics and diplomacy. Her example inspired other women to seek power and influence in their own right. The image of Eleanor in popular culture has evolved over the centuries. In her own time, she was both admired and criticised. Her supporters praised her beauty, intelligence, and political skill. Her detractors condemned her as proud, willful, and immoral. The rumours about her behaviour on the Second Crusade followed her throughout her life and beyond. Medieval chroniclers often portrayed Eleanor in negative terms. They blamed her for the failure of the Crusade and for the rebellion against Henry. They repeated scandalous stories about her relationships with other men. They saw her as a dangerous woman who had overstepped the proper bounds of female behaviour. These hostile accounts shaped how Eleanor was remembered for centuries. The Renaissance and early modern period largely forgot Eleanor. She was overshadowed by other historical figures and dismissed as a minor player in the great events of her time. It was not until the 19th century that historians began to reassess her significance. They recognised her as one of the most remarkable figures of the medieval period, a woman whose influence had shaped the course of history. Modern portrayals of Eleanor have generally been sympathetic. She's been the subject of novels, plays, films, and television series. The most famous dramatic portrayal is probably Katharine Hepburn's performance in the 1968 film The Lion in Winter, which depicted Eleanor's conflict with Henry over the succession. This portrayal emphasised Eleanor's intelligence, wit, and indomitable spirit. Historians continue to debate various aspects of Eleanor's life. The nature of her relationship with her uncle Raymond during the Second Crusade remains controversial. The extent of her involvement in the rebellion of 1173 is disputed. The reality of the courts of love is questioned, but there is no disagreement about her fundamental importance. Eleanor was one of the most significant figures of the medieval period, and her influence extended far beyond her own lifetime. Eleanor's life spanned one of the most dynamic periods in medieval history. She was born when the crusading movement was at its height, and the feudal system was firmly established. She died as new forces were beginning to transform European society. She witnessed the rise of the Plantagenet Empire and the beginning of its decline. She saw the flowering of troubadour culture and the emergence of new literary forms. She lived through wars, rebellions, and political upheavals that reshaped the map of Europe. Through all of these changes, Eleanor remained a central figure. She was not merely a witness to history, but an active participant in shaping it. She made decisions that affected the lives of millions. She supported causes and individuals who changed the course of events. She left her mark on everything she touched. Eleanor's energy from early youth to old age was unrivaled. At 25, she went on crusade. At 70, she crossed the Alps to fetch a bride for her son, and later travelled to Germany with the ransom to free him from prison. At nearly 80, she crossed the Pyrenees to select a granddaughter for a diplomatic marriage. Her vitality and determination never flagged, even as her body aged. The qualities that made Eleanor remarkable were evident throughout her life. She was intelligent, able to understand complex political situations and devise effective strategies. She was determined, pursuing her goals with relentless energy. She was adaptable, adjusting to changing circumstances and finding new ways to exercise influence. She was resilient, surviving imprisonment, the deaths of her children, and countless other setbacks without losing her spirit. Eleanor was also flawed as all human beings are. She could be proud and imperious. She could be vindictive toward those who crossed her. Her support for her son's rebellion against their father showed a willingness to put her own interests above family unity. Her favoritism among her children caused resentment and conflict. She was not a saint, and she never pretended to be one. But Eleanor's flaws were inseparable from her strengths. Her pride gave her the confidence to act decisively in a world that expected women to be passive. Her determination to advance her children's interests was an expression of maternal love, even if it sometimes led her astray. Her willingness to defy convention allowed her to achieve things that more conventional women could never have accomplished. Eleanor of Aquitaine died over 800 years ago, but she remains a figure of fascination and inspiration. Her life story has all the elements of great drama: love and betrayal, war and peace, triumph and tragedy. She was a queen, a crusader, a prisoner, and a survivor. She was a patron of the arts and a master of politics. She was, in the words of one historian, perhaps the greatest queen that ever lived.